So you want to learn how to code. One of the first things that you may have thought of is what language to learn first. There's many choices like Python, Java, C++, and that's just to name a few, and there are many more. Really though, it doesn't matter which one you start with. First off, programming is more about problem solving, and the choice of programming language is merely a tool that you use to solve a problem. This leads into my next point, which is that most programming languages work in pretty much the same way, at least as far as the practical writing of the code goes. Basically, as long as you know the common concepts and patterns which most programming languages use, to learn any given programming language is relatively easy. So for that reason, I'll be using C++ for this practical demonstration on how to code. C++ does a pretty good job of showing you many common concepts and patterns which you may encounter. So, that said, take a moment to set up your C++ development tools. In my case, I am using Linux, VS Code, and Terminal. So, first things first, what I need is a plan. So, I'm going to make a random password generator. So, how do I want it to work? First off, the user will be asked whether or not they want to generate a password. If yes, the password is generated, and if no, then the program will exit. This whole process will run in a loop until the user enters no. Now I can start. So, first off, I'm going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it testdemo.cpp. Now, most C++ programs should start with this, and you have to have a main function. Which returns 0. Alright, so I'm going to start with this part, which asks the user whether or not they want to generate a password. So, how do I do that? Well, first I have to get the user input. Then, once I've done that, I have to check if the user has entered yes or no. Now, before checking the input has to exist first. So in other words, it has to be saved. Now to save data, you can use a variable. So how do you create a variable? There are 3 parts to a variable. The first is the type. The type defines what kind of data the variable can hold, as well as what kind of operations you can do with that data. Then you have the name of the variable, and the name must be unique. Now, these 2 things, the type and the name, are required. Next, you have the value of the variable. Now, the value is not required, but in most cases, you should put it in. Now, there are many types that you can use. This is a short list of some which might be useful. So, let's start with saving the user input. I'm going to start out by creating a variable to hold the user input. Initially, the user is entering in yes or no. These are words. So basically, text. So, since I'm storing text, I'm going to use a string. So the type will be a string, and the name of it will be user input. And for now, I'm going to leave it blank and not assign a value. Now, whenever you use a string, you have to put this part in. And I'll explain more about this later on. For now, here's the short reason. So here, I've used the string type. Now, the string type is in the string library. Since I'm using the string library, what I have to do is import the string library. So that's why I put in the include string part. Now, when using something from a library, you have to specify the namespace of that library. Now, the string library is a standard library, and the namespace for all standard libraries is std. That's why when I specified the string type, I had to write std and then two colons and then string. So that's the basic idea. I'll be explaining more about this later on. Before I continue on, note also that most lines in C++ must end with a semicolon. So, the value of the user input is, well, the user input. So, how do we get the input from the user? Well, if you don't know how to do something, which as I'm recording this, I don't, you can just look it up. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's a perfectly normal thing to do. So, when looking things up, you have to be specific. So, I am using C++, and what I want to do is get user input. And this looks like it might be useful. So, it looks like what they're doing here is they're first creating a blank variable. Then, it looks like they're saving the user input in a separate step. So, that's exactly what I'm going to do. In my case, my variable name is user input. So, cin and then this user input. And I have an error here because I did not put in std and then two colons. This part here with the std I will explain later as well. So, I now have the user input. Great. What I did not do, however, is ask the user to enter in yes or no. So basically, what I want to do is print to the terminal a message. So, how do I print something to the terminal? Well, I don't know, so I'm just going to look it up. So, C++ and print to terminal. Stack Overflow can be a good source, but sometimes you have to look through multiple answers to find the one which works for you. So, I'm going to go with this one. And this is exactly what I'm looking for. Now, you should not just blindly copy and paste things without at least knowing how to use it. So, what I'm going to do is mess around a bit with this and see how it works. I'm going to make a test file and call it codetest.cpp. And I'm going to include the usual include statement. And I'm going to put in the main function. Now that I have that basic stuff, I'm going to paste in the thing which I just copied. And I have an error again, so I'm going to fix that by putting in the std part, which I will explain later. Note that in C++, most lines have to end with a semicolon. Alright, so now let's try to figure out how cout works. Cout being the thing which I just copied. So with my setup, this is how I run code. If you don't know how to run code with your setup, take a moment now to figure it out. Your way will likely be different. So I'm gonna run what I have so far. And look at that. I see print a string and print a string. Maybe I can print out the value of a variable instead. So what if I made an int, call it, say, test variable, and its value will be 7. And I'm going to replace this here string, and strings are denoted by a pair of double quotes. So I'm going to put test variable here instead. Now I'm going to run it again, and I see 7. So it is possible to print out the value of a variable. Maybe it's possible to print out the value of a mathematical operation. So I'm going to make another int, and I'm going to call it test variable 1. And the value is 7. And I'm going to add the 2. Maybe that'll work. Now, when I run this, I should see 14 in the terminal. And guess what? I see 14. So, that worked. Now, the value of a variable must match its type. For example, this here is an int. And an int is basically a whole number that does not have a decimal. The value here is 7, which is a whole number and does not have a decimal. Now I don't need this anymore, so I'm going to remove it. Now what I'm going to do is change the value of test variable to 7.7 and see what happens. Note that 7.7 is a number which has a decimal. Well, it printed out 7, and it ignored the 0.7. The variable did not fully capture the value which I had assigned, so that's kind of a problem. But the program did not crash. This is the best case scenario, where something unexpected happens, but the program still works otherwise. What I'm going to show you next is the worst case scenario. What I'm going to do now is make the value 7, as in the text 7, and not the number 7. And this red here means that I have an error, so this will not work. But I'm going to run it anyways, and as you can see, it errored out. So this is the worst case, where your program crashes and just will not run at all. This is why the value of a variable must match its type. At best, your program will run, except the result will not be what you expect, so that's a problem. At worst, your program will not run and will just straight up crash, which is an even worse problem. So, I'm just going to change the value of this back to the number 7. Now, what if what I wanted to do was store the numbers 1 to 5? One thing I could do is just copy this thing another 3 times. Then I need to rename these new variables. Well, now what if what I wanted to do was store the numbers 1 to 100? I could just copy this a bunch of times, but that would get annoying really fast. Instead, what you can do is use what I call containers. Now, that's not the formal name for them, but I think it describes what they do pretty well. So, there are 2 types of containers. First, there is fixed size, which has a maximum capacity. Then there's expandable, which can grow and shrink depending on how much you have to store. So, in C++, this is a fixed size container. It's called an array. So, how do I make an array? Simple, like this. So, when creating an array, the process is quite similar to creating a variable. You have the type, then the name, then you specify how many pieces of data that you want to store. Now, in the example which I just copied, the type was an int, so let's change that to, say, a double. And let's also change the name to, say, array of doubles. And let's say that I want this array to hold a maximum of, say, 5 numbers. Now, within this pair of braces, what I'm going to do is put in a list of 5 numbers separated by commas. Why 5 numbers? Well, the maximum capacity of this array is 5 pieces of data. What I could also do is insert any other number of elements, so long as this number of elements is greater than 0 but less than or equal to the maximum capacity of the array. The value of an array is always a comma-separated list. This is a fixed size container. Now in C++, there are many kinds of containers which are expandable. One which I use often is called a vector. So, how do you make a vector? Now, as I'm recording this, I don't actually remember, so I'm just going to look it up. In this case, I am directly looking up a vector because I already know that this specific thing exists. Anyways, this source looks useful, so I'm going to try this. Now, let's see if I can find an example on how to make a vector. Something like this. So, this is how you make a vector. Now, I have an error here, and that's because I don't have the std part, and I will of course explain that later. And furthermore, because I am using a vector, I also have to include this bit here, which I will explain later on also. Creating a vector is also very similar to creating a variable. You start with a type, which in this case is vector. Now, with a vector, you have to specify the type of the data which the vector will hold. So, in the example which I copied, the type of this data was an int. I'm just going to change that to a double. Then, after the type, you have the name. So let's just call this vector of doubles. Finally, we assign a value to the vector, and I do this in the same way as I did with the array. So I start with a pair of braces, then within these braces, I put in a list of values which is separated by commas. Now a vector is an expandable container, meaning that there is no set limit as to how many things it can hold. So then, let's say that I want this vector to hold 3 things. Within the pair of braces, all I'm going to do is put in a comma-separated list containing 3 doubles, or 3 numbers which contain decimals. So, that's how you make a vector. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, how do you access data which is stored within a container? Well, you can do so with indexing. So, indexing is basically how the program counts. Let's say that I have a container that contains 2 ints, the numbers 45 and 57. Normally, I would count 1, 2, as in there are 2 things in this container. But the program counts 0, 1. Now, this container still contains 2 things. The difference is that the program considers the first thing to be item number 0. The second thing is therefore item number 1. We can use this concept to access data within containers. So, the index is used in what is called subscripting. Let's say that what I wanted to do was access the second element of the vector. So first what I would do is get the name of the container. In this case, it is the vector. The next thing I need is a pair of square brackets. Inside these square brackets goes the index. So what is the index of this value, the one which I've highlighted? Counting normally, I go 1, 2, 3. But the program counts 0, 1. So then, if I want the index of the second element, the index is 1. So now I'm going to run this, and it works out just fine. I get 2.2, which is the second element. Now, if I want the third element, which is this, what is the index that I need? So, 0, 1, 2. The index is 2, so therefore I put in 2 for the index, and I should get 3.3. And I see in the terminal 3.3. So now let's say that I want to access the fourth element of the array. I swap the name of the vector with the name of the array, and the fourth element is 0, 1, 2, 3. Now I change the index to 3, and I see in the terminal 4.4. That's what I expect, so it works. So let's get back to the password generation program. I stopped last at printing a message to the terminal. So I figured out how to do that here. So I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to change it so that it prints out a string. And the message will be, do you want to generate a random password? And just to make sure that this works, I am also going to print out the user input that the user has entered. So I'm going to run the program now. Do you want to generate a random password? Yes, I do. Now at this point, it doesn't really matter what I type in because I'm not checking the input. So I'm just going to say yes, and it looks like it works. So now that I have the input from the user, I need to check whether it is yes or no. There are a few ways to validate conditions and inputs, which I'll be doing next.